Good evening, and welcome to the forum at the Institute of Politics at the Harvard University. I'm Maggie Williams, Director of the Institute of Politics. Tonight's forum is co-sponsored by the Office of the President of Harvard University and the Harvard Black Student Association. Thank you for your co-sponsorship. Our guests this evening present a panoramic view of the issues and interests that collided in response to the shooting death of Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old African-American teenager in Ferguson, Missouri. Professor Charles Ogletree, the Harvard Law School Jesse Clemenco Professor of Law, will moderate this discussion. Professor Ogletree is also the founding and executive director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. He is a prominent legal theorist and author of numerous books and articles, and has an international reputation for unwinding the complex issues of law, especially as they pertain to constitutional rights. Welcome, Professor Ogletree.
Well, good evening. Let me welcome all of you here to the Kennedy School. It's a wonderful opportunity to be the moderator of this panel. I know everybody has some familiarity with the case of Michael Brown and what it meant, what it continues to mean, and we're going to have a robust discussion. I want to say a little bit about the process so people understand that we'll have the panel give certain remarks, and they're all are here. And then we're going to have Mayor from Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings-Blake. She's going to be coming in from Skype and giving a few remarks as well. And then we're going to have some questions from the audience. And now it's a little bit after 6, it's not quite 7 p.m. yet. And so I want you to start thinking about your questions, because a brilliant question, a terrific question, a soaring question in this forum has no more than 8 words in it. So you have time to do all the editing, make everything work, and make it happen. And I hate to be the enforcer, but I am, right? And if you're asking questions longer than 8 words, we don't care who you are. We do care who you are, but don't tell us who you are, your background. Just ask your question and focus on it now so we can get as many questions as possible in this forum. I'm joined today by 3 wonderful people in person, and then a person coming through Skype. First, Pastor Reverend Hammond, I've known for many, many years. He's going to give remarks on community and race relations. Ray Hammond, is he here? Right here, okay, good. All right, and also a good friend that I've known for decades when we were both younger, from Washington, D.C., is Dr. Lee Brown, who is the chief of police. He's going to talk about policing, Lee Brown. And finally, the media expert who I've not met, but I met today, Alex Jones, who's done a great job, and is going to talk about both the individuals in the media's role, is going to talk about what happened in Ferguson. Please join me in welcoming and thanking all of our 3 speakers today. I'm going to introduce the 4th person. I'll introduce her again when she comes on Skype, hopefully, and that's Mayor of Baltimore, Miss Stephanie Rawlings-Blake. Her father was a well-known activist in the community of Baltimore. My wife's from Baltimore. I know a lot about that community. She's spoken at a lot of forums that I've had so far, and she's done a great job as the woman mayor of the city of Baltimore. And I hope you'll welcome her now, but also welcome her when she comes, Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake as well. Each of the speakers will have 4 to 5 minutes to talk, and they usually speak much longer, and I will be tugging at their backs to remind them, you got 30 seconds left. So we're going to try to get all this done, and you'll see this discipline that you see here with the speakers. We hope that you'll have the same discipline as the panelists. Let me say a word first about the case. It's something that I remember very well. I was in the middle of my vacation in August, and I heard the young man, 18 years old, unarmed, was shot and killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. Heard he was only 18 years old, had his hands up, and more evidence has come out since then. And so I was, as usual, thinking about it as a parent and as a grandparent, you know, what happens. And I know that there were men in Ferguson, Missouri, mainly black men, when people said that a teenage boy was killed. And they're wondering, was my son shot? You know, he's a middle-class kid, he's a working-class kid, you know. And you know that this young man, Michael Brown, was about to go on to trade school the next day before he was killed by Officer Wilson. And it's not done yet. I'm getting all types of emails for people who are said that the same thing happened to my son or daughter. And it just reminded me, in many respects, of what happened to Trayvon Martin in 2012, the whole issue of black boys and what's happened to them. And I hope that this panel will be an uplifting opportunity for us to talk about race and talk about it in different contexts and talk about justice. How do we make our children and grandchildren and people that we're mentoring make them part of the 21st century and make a big difference. And we'll have now each of the people come up and have a chance to talk a little bit about what they're doing and how important they're going to do. First, Pastor Hammond, Ray Hammond, is going to talk about the community and race relations. Please welcome him.
Here we are again, trying to figure out why another unarmed young black man is dead after an encounter with the police. This would be even more painful were it not so numbness-inducing in its familiarity. There's so much we don't know about what happened, but we do know that after some kind of altercation between Officer Darren Wilson and citizen Michael Brown, Michael took 2 to the head and 4 in the right arm. We draw cold comfort from the fact that that is 35 fewer bullets than the number fired at Amadou Diallo 15 years ago. Made the mistake of trying to take out his wallet to identify himself to police officers. I'm not alleging any kind of conspiracy, just noting that many people, minority and majority, feel that something is terribly wrong. Or as the boss, Bruce Springsteen, put it, no secret, my friend, no secret, my friend. You can get killed just for living in your American skin. Ferguson has become such a textbook case for how not to build harmonious community or race relationships, especially with regard to law enforcement and criminal justice. And while we don't fully know what happened in Ferguson on August 9th, here are a few things that we do know, and that this reminds us. You really do have to look at the data. You have to really look at how you're interacting with the community that you're policing. It's a lesson that Cincinnati learned painfully in 2001. They had to make major adjustments to discover that there was a real difference in the way that minorities were being handled, and in particular by certain officers. They had to make changes in policies, and sometimes changes in policemen. But the result was that when they did, when they made it their business to really look at the data and change their behavior accordingly, their relationship with the community changed dramatically. We know that. We know that community partnerships have to be built before the crisis. That when someone is dead and the community is in flames, that's not the time at which you can begin to talk about building partnership. It's the moment at which relationships of trust that were built long before can help, or at least get us through and move us toward a more constructive place. We know that you can't have a community with 63% minority members and 6% minority uniformed officers. That in the 21st century, people really do look at how that department is structured and who's in it. And they're looking for evidence that they are reflected there. It's fascinating that the military, in many respects, has done a whole lot better on this and has incredible lessons to teach about the fact that qualified minority candidates really are available, that they have to be brought in, and that career paths have to be established for them. And they've got to be reflected not just in those who are on the street, but those who are in the leadership and making the policies. I wonder what might have happened if Ferguson had spent as much time studying those lessons from the military and less time studying military hardware and tactics. I don't want anyone to think that I'm anti-police. Having sat in and talked in police academies and police fora and participated in citizens academies and pastored and partnered with police officers at all levels, I know how committed the majority of police are to being public servants and the price that they sometimes pay for that. I know the difference that good community policing can make, its ability to really divert young people and its ability to really intervene in their lives, and in some cases actually save them by taking them off the streets. I know the difference that community policing can make. We've seen it here in Boston and other places across the country. And I readily acknowledge the role that our communities must play. This isn't law enforcement's job alone. In the community, you, all of us have to be honest brokers, bridges between generations and between institutions. I'm not sure that the scholar and writer Jelani Cobb is right when he entitled a recent article, "A Movement Grows in Ferguson." But I think he's right on the money when he says this: more than one person in the streets of Ferguson has compared what is happening here to the chaotic days of the Birmingham desegregation campaign in 1963. And like that struggle, the local authorities, long immune to public sentiment, were incapable of understanding how their actions reverberated outside the hermetic world where they held sway, how they looked to the world. That incomprehension was the biggest asset the protesters in Birmingham had. Michael Brown was left lying in the street for hours while a traumatized community stood behind police tape in frustration, grief, and shock. An immobile metaphor for everything that was wrong in Ferguson, Missouri. And not Ferguson alone. But my hope is that what comes out of this is that we really take a hard look at just how critical this issue of relations, police and communities, really is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pastor Hammond, and very happy now to have Dr. Lee Brown speak about policing. He has been the first black mayor of Houston, Texas. He's also been the police commissioner in New York and Houston. And even more importantly, he has spent a lot of time in my great state, being educated in the state of California. And he's a country boy, so to speak. We'll hear more about that. But talking about policing, we're very happy to have him with us. Please welcome Dr. Lee Brown.
Thank you very much. You're going to need to fix your mic. Yeah. This does not count against my time. No. I'm very pleased to be here today. As mentioned, I'm someone who has spent a professional career in law enforcement. And I must admit that I was saddened and bewildered as I witnessed the events unfold in Ferguson, Missouri. Law enforcement's first response in that city reminded me of the 1960s when many American police agencies responded to urban unrest or the fear of urban unrest by arming themselves with military equipment, not unlike that which our armed forces personnel uses when it engages an enemy in combat. I strongly believe that the tactics such as that should not be used by American law enforcement agencies against citizens of our country. To do so just is not consistent for policing in a democratic society. Let me suggest to you this evening that there is a philosophy of policing that would have prevented the events that occurred in Ferguson. And that philosophy is called community policing. As police chief in Houston, Texas, I implemented the principles of that concept in a city in which the police and the citizens were at odds and alienated from one another. In fact, when I went to Houston in 1982, its police department had a national reputation for brutality and racism. By implementing community policing, we were able to transform that agency into one of the most respected police agencies in the nation. I'm convinced that if Ferguson's police department had adopted and implemented community policing as their dominant style of delivering police services to the city of that city, the recent events would not have occurred. First, the officer would have known Michael Brown, the young man that was killed. Second, if a shooting did take place, the people would not immediately conclude that the police were wrong, because you would have built up an atmosphere of mutual trust. Under community policing, every officer must understand that they are part of and not apart from the community they serve. With that understanding, the people are seen as allies and not targets. And you just don't shoot your allies. Community policing demands that officers get to know and interact with people who live or work in neighborhoods that they patrol. Officers are trained to communicate with young people, help solve neighborhood problems. They're trained to develop an appreciation of cultural and ethnic differences, and do so without putting a value judgment on them as being good or bad because they differ from their own. In fact, under community policing, officers are not just evaluated on the number of arrests they make, they're also assessed on their ability to solve problems and the absence of crime in their assigned areas. And most important, community policing is value-driven. For example, I believe that every police agency should have as its core value the importance of human life. They must understand that deadly force is only to be used to protect their lives or the life of a citizen. Now, in order to implement the concept of community policing, the agency must change all the systems that support the organization. They must begin by hiring people not in the spirit of adventure, but in the spirit of service. And most important, under community policing, the police agency must ensure that the racial composition of their department mirror the racial composition of their city. They must train their officers to be problem solvers. Departments must evaluate their officers on the absence of crime and not just the number of arrests they make. What do I mean by community policing? I define community policing as a partnership between the police and the public to do essentially three things. Number one, to work together to prevent crime. Number two, to work together to arrest those who commit crimes. And number three, to work together to solve problems and thereby improve the quality of neighborhood life. I believe that community policing is the most effective and prudent manner of policing that will work in any city in this country. if properly adopted and properly implemented, community policing will prevent events such as those we have witnessed in Ferguson. It's a concept that I implemented in New York City. And after 1 year, crime went down in every index category, and that had not happened in almost 40 years. And we did so without the project called Stop and Frisk. What can you do? In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson established the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice. The recommendations that came out of that commission helped make police officers, helped make police departments more professional. What can you do? I would urge each of you to write our president and ask him to establish a national commission to draft a blueprint for improving the police and indeed the entire American system for the administration of justice. I think if we do that, if we follow our advice, we can make a difference in policing in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to hear from Alex Jones talking about the media and what the media has been able to do. It's very important to look at this very impressive background. People here know the work that he's done here at the Kennedy School and at his appointment. He's the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. He's also the Lawrence M. Lombard Lecturer in the Press and Public Policy. He worked for the New York Times. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. He also was a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard, a host of National Public Radio's On the Media, and a great person that we're going to learn a lot about the media, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. Right, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, and I'm honored to be here with such a distinguished group to talk about this very important issue. And the media, of course, are always, well-deserving of bashing for a variety of things. I think that is something that goes without saying. There was a recent poll of the area around Ferguson, the communities around Ferguson, asking about the media coverage and what people thought about it, and both black and white respondents were very critical of the media. The whites were more critical than the black, but the point was that everyone felt that the media did not do a great job, did not distinguish itself. I come from a journalism background, as you know, and I tend to be perhaps a little more sympathetic with the situation journalists are in a situation like this. Perhaps in a certain way, like looking at the perspective of the police and bringing a measure of understanding to it. That said, there was, of course, sensationalism and all of the usual sins of media in a sensational situation. People reporting erroneously, people saying things on air, especially on television, that were inappropriate. One of the CNN correspondents got very sort of emotional and was quite clearly not trying to be dispassionate or objective at all, which is something I think people actually want in journalists. Unfortunately, I think television news especially is increasingly inclined to encourage on-air correspondents to be personal, to give, to talk about what their feelings are. This is a very emotional situation. It was a very emotional and traumatic one for the people involved, on both the activist participants, the people in the community, and the journalists covering it in many respects, and that was reflected. But what I actually want to talk more about tonight is not what went wrong. I think it's a pretty normal catalog, but what I thought actually was importantly right, and the impact of that coverage that was right, perhaps a long-term impact. First of all, it was a moment in which new media, of course, is not something new anymore, but it was something in which new media played a huge role. How many of you here in the audience follow Black Twitter? Well, it's something that a great number of black people do follow, but a great number of people who are not black do not, at least did not until the attention that Black Twitter began to play and the role it began to play in the aftermath of this incident at Ferguson. The hashtag, "If they gunned me down," was something that really took on a viral aspect. And it is something that I think is a good thing in the sense that it is making something that has been almost entirely, narrowly experienced by black people, something that is now got a significantly broader audience, a broader understanding of the point of view and the attitudes of black people in a situation like this. Black Twitter is not, the reflection of all black views or all black voices, but it is a very powerful new tool for black people to speak to each other and therefore to speak to us all. I think that it is important to remember too that just as in the 1960s, when television was hugely important in shaming this country into doing the right thing, by putting on the air, by forcing Americans to see what it looked like for American policemen to use fire hoses in club demonstrators who were trying to demonstrate about something that was clearly morally wrong. I think that in this kind of situation, this particular situation, there was a great deal of that same kind of imagery that shocked America, much of America anyway, back into a recognition in a new way that something profound was going on, not just in Ferguson, but everywhere. The imagery that resonated particularly powerfully with me were those black, usually mostly black, local Ferguson community members who were demonstrating after this happened in the days and in some cases weeks afterwards. And they had little children holding up signs that said, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." And they were confronted with policemen dressed like military soldiers in a bitterly hostile environment with guns pointed and tear gas flowing, and were being told to disperse for having done nothing more than protest. That is something that is not the way America thinks of itself. And I think that the media did a great service to us all by making those images something that were so vivid. They were vivid because that was what was happening. And what was happening in Ferguson in particular, not in Houston perhaps, but in Ferguson, and I think by extension, a lot of people would say it could happen many other places as well, was something that needed to be addressed and acknowledged. One of the most appalling aspects of the coverage to me, of course, was, quite frankly, the Fox News style coverage of people, basically making a kind of argument that this was not something that should be viewed through a racial prism, which was nonsense, which was, of course, ridiculous. But at the same time, some of the best coverage, the best news coverage, to my mind, was done, as usual, by Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, in which he didn't have to make anything up. He just put the clips of what people were saying on the air, what the police were saying, what the city officials were saying, what the people there were saying. That is powerful journalism, to my mind. Another thing that I believe happened that was really important and a service that the media has given this country is to create a genuinely new policy issue, and that is the militarization of police departments. That's something that has happened since the War on Terror, because there was an awful lot of money floating around, and an awful lot of police departments used it to create, police departments that were paramilitary almost, certainly the way they dressed, Why was a police department that was out dealing with a situation like this dressed in camouflage with helmets that looked like they were, they would have been suitable for Iraq? Why would that be? I think it makes not just black Americans nervous, it makes, or should make, all Americans nervous, because that's not policing, that's something else. My point is that the media, I believe, has been successful in putting that issue on the national agenda. And that, I believe, is part of the service that media, in its imperfect and flawed way, can do in a situation like this. It has made this issue, as well as the issue of how a city like Ferguson can govern itself in a way that is sensitive to the majority of its citizens. That's something that is also a part of the Kennedy School's mandate, and something that I hope the media will have accomplished there and in other places as well. One of the things that I think has become clear is that Ferguson is a town that is living with a governmental structure that was appropriate when it was a very different kind of town, but that has endured. And it is a town now ripe, not just for protest, but for political action, for voting, for electing public officials who will basically change the way the policing is done, consolidate with other communities around, and make it not a place that does not reflect the people who live there. The government, the police department, these things need to be a part of a whole. This is out of whack, but there is a mechanism there, obviously, to correct that, and that's politics. And that's what I'm glad to say this place is all about. Change, activism, doing something to make it better. I believe, ultimately, overall, the media had a positive role in doing those things in this particular case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And now we're hoping to hear through Skype from Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake from Baltimore talking about political leadership. And many people, there she is. So Mayor Blake, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, the Institute of Politics, for having me. I am going to apologize in advance. I am recovering from a bit of bronchitis, so if I'm talking slow, it is just so I can get through all of my notes. Any of you who have suffered through it this season knows that it's tough on the lungs. So, but I wouldn't want to miss this opportunity. I want to thank all of this evening's participants, as I have enjoyed listening to the discussions and hearing the questions. As a public official with the responsibility of overseeing a major police department in a majority African American city, I've taken a lot of steps to what I believe is repair the relationship between the community and the police. And because of that, we have seen results in the crime fight. My experience as mayor has shown me that building trust between the communities, particularly communities of color, is something that you have to do consistently and systematically. You can't just perform temporary outreach and communication when an incident like what happened in Ferguson occurs. This work has to go on in good times and in bad times. Under my administration, Baltimore has seen some of the lowest numbers of homicide and lowest crime numbers in a generation. But I was very much aware that at the same time, during some of our most successful years, the distrust of the police department was also at its highest. I know that in order for my city to be a safer place, we have to do more, and we have to work in partnership with the community. And my advocacy on behalf of greater transparency and building trust between the police and the public goes back to when I was on the city council. As city council president, I was one of the leading voices pushing for what we called the implementation of a teachable moment. And that's because I believe that more had to be done. When we would have incidents of police misconduct, I thought that it was important that we use those incidents to be instructive to other police officers about how to respond in those situations. What's the right thing to do? What was the wrong thing to do? So so we could learn. You know, it's one thing to shine a spotlight on the problem. It's another thing to learn from that problem. That work has continued as I've been mayor, where under my administration, we've seen discourtesy complaints against the Baltimore Police Department decrease. And we've seen citizen participation through the reporting of crime increase significantly. This is not something that I take lightly at all, which is why I've worked hard this year to have a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue with the community about how to rebuild the trust and send a message that law enforcement is actually acting unlawfully is something that I will not tolerate. It's something that the police commissioner will not tolerate. I had public safety forums throughout the city, and we collected surveys in those public safety forums in each of the 9 police districts. It was clear in each of those forums, the issue that was highest on the minds of the residents was not just reducing violence and reducing homicides in the city, but was also having a better relationship with the police. And my administration is actively working and weighing policy proposals that would bring more transparency to the process and make it easier for people to hold people accountable when they act unlawfully. One of those proposals, once those proposals are developed, I'll go back to the community and work with them to inform that policy process, because the work has to be ongoing. Again, I, like many of the speakers before me, had a lot of concern about what I saw in Ferguson. I thought, unfortunately, it was an example of a teachable moment for me as a mayor and public officials all throughout the country on what not to do. You cannot go to the community after an incident happens and think that you have the basis for the types of conversations that were necessary after Michael Brown was killed. There is a sacred bond between the police and the community, and when it is broken, there's a lot of repair work that needs to be done, and you have to be able to speak from a place of trust and respect, and you just can't get that on the fly. Baltimore, if we take the role of the police very seriously, and we understand there is a time and place for that military equipment, and that is in my mind in the response to a terrorist threat or a natural disaster that requires that level of intervention. When we participate in those activities of emergency preparedness, we don't ever think about using the equipment that we have against our own citizens, and certainly not for just exercising their right of free speech. Baltimore is one of the only cities that was able to break down the Occupy movement encampments without incident, and it is because we took the role of the police department very seriously. We also look for ways, other ways, more ways, broader ways to include the community in the work that we're doing right in the police department. And we have members of the community who are now a part of the panel when officers are up for promotion. So the community members who are directly impacted by the leadership roles of police officers are now a part of that process. And again, this is something that you have to do on a consistent basis. It's not just something that you can do after an incident happened and think that you were going to have the level of trust necessary to impact change. So again, Baltimore is certainly not a perfect city. We have our own issues of police brutality that we deal with. The challenge for me as a mayor and other mayors around the country is what we do in the face of that. And I think it is to call it for what it is and to look for ways and look for comprehensive reforms to make it easier to hold these bad actors accountable. Why? Because every time a man or woman shows up for duty for the police department, they're putting their lives on the line. And they're put at risk by, they're put in harm's way just as much as a community when we have police officers who don't respect the uniform and don't respect that sacred relationship they have between with the community. And it is a challenge that we have to confront on a daily basis. And from what I have seen, it's a challenge that has not been taken up in Ferguson. And my prayer for that community is that this is a wake-up call and a teachable moment for everyone about the types of relationships that you have to have progress. Thank you.
So as the other panelists are coming up, taking their seat, Pastor Hammond, then Dr. Lee, and then Mr. Jones, I want the first question to go to Mayor Rawlings-Blake, if you can, and then if people want to get in these audiences and ask some questions, they can do that too. Mayor, let me ask you this. You talked a lot about what you've been doing in Baltimore, and it's been extremely helpful to change the focus from crime to education. Can you say a word about the whole curfew that you have imposed and how that's working? Mm-hmm. It's different from what people think about curfews and what's happened in Baltimore.
The issue of the curfew law raised it raised its profile nationally, I think because of misinformation. In Baltimore, we've had a curfew for over 20 years. We've had a curfew center since 2008. And we have it for very common sense reasons. When I grew up, when the street lights came on, your parents expected you to be home or expected you to be supervised by a responsible adult. And this curfew law is a way to get back to that. But this is about making sure that after a certain time, we have different times for the school year and in the summer, that if you're a young person, that you're either at home or being supervised by a responsible adult, period. And it's giving us a chance to identify those young people who are falling through the cracks, that don't have anyone to help them, so we can connect those families with resources. And that is what the result of that curfew has been. I think there were a lot of concerns raised by the ACLU that we were trying to criminalize young people, but the evidence doesn't support that. There has not been a dramatic increase in juvenile arrests. Instead, what we've seen, because we've publicized that, is a continued reduction in the number of curfew offenders. Why? Because parents have been made more aware of their responsibility as parents, and caregivers are being made aware of their responsibility as caregivers. And it's giving us a chance to connect those young people that otherwise would fall through the cracks with the resources that they need. You know, is it a perfect system? No, but my focus has always been on protecting our young people. I loathe when you have an incident, whether it's in Baltimore or somewhere else in the country, where a young person is out 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, and something happens, they fall in harm's way. And the question is always after the fact, where were the parents? Where were the adults? Where were those things? And that's a question that I don't ever want to ask after the fact. I'm going to do as much as I can to protect our kids ahead of time. So we are looking out and caring for our kids so they don't fall in that position. And I'm very proud of the work that we're doing with the Youth Connection Centers to make sure that we have advocates and social workers who are trained, that want to help young people, that want to help families, to connect them to the resources so we can protect the future for our young people.
Thank you very much appreciate that. Let me start with Reverend Hammond, and all the folks can get involved in one respect or another. And Mayor Rawlings-Blake, you should interrupt any time that you want. Don't wait for us. We'll make sure you're a part of it. And one of the things, you and your wife, Gloria, came to Harvard Medical School and were both doctors doing work on patients that had a serious number of problems. And you left that to get involved in the ministry. And you left in the ministry, you started this whole idea, the 10-point coalition, right? And the whole idea was that you did something that was remarkable to try to deal with the issue of young people and crime. You want to say a little bit about the 10-point coalition and how you got involved in it?
Sure. In the late 1980s, Boston, like most cities across the country, was in the midst of a pretty profound uptick in violent crime. And I think there was a lot of despair about what to do. That was certainly true here in Boston and true in a lot of cities. And I think what we discovered in a number of ways, or many of us came to feel, that it wasn't enough to just lay the responsibility for dealing with this at the feet of the police or at the feet of the political system, but to recognize that communities really have to be engaged in their own safety and security. And that's true for a number of reasons, not the least of which is I grew up in Philadelphia at a time when this gang warfare was really rife. And for lots of reasons, I managed to come through that. And the question for me was, how do I do that for another generation? But more important, I think also we were really challenging community institutions, and especially the church, to get engaged, to not let young people end up chewed up and spit out and destroyed by the streets. So I think the thing that we recognized then was that this had to be about partnership. We had to work with young people, we had to be engaged with the police, and that meant we had to be, as I said, engaged and honest brokers. So when the police did the right thing, we had to say they were doing the right thing and back them. And if they did the wrong thing, hold them accountable. And that we had to be held accountable as well. So I think that remains true, that we've all got to be engaged in this. This isn't just a law enforcement or criminal justice problem. This is all of our problem.
Okay, and let me ask you this, and one of the other things that made it clear was that ministers were going out not at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, but late at night, meeting young people, talking about that. It had to be a little frightening. How did you do it, and why did you do it?
Yeah, in some ways it was new, it was unfamiliar, but I think it was less frightening for me than continuing to watch young people get killed and kill each other, or commit suicide by cop, which I've also, is a phenomenon I've seen over and over again. Something different had to happen, and I took the position that we had to be a part of that. We were responsible. We lived there. We looked like, I'll never forget someone saying, why would I expect a policeman who doesn't look like that kid to care if I look like that kid and I'm not involved?
Very important. Dr. Brown, let me ask you this. You've been in law enforcement for a very long time, and what are the lessons that you've learned that you hope are sustained? The streets are turning back to what happened back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's there again. What were you trying to implement, and what do you think made a difference in police thinking about their job, which is not just, it really was to protect and to serve, but the reality is, what were you doing that made a difference the time that you were in the police departments in New York and other places as well?
My objective was to develop a general understanding between police and the community that if we're concerned about keeping our cities safe, the police cannot do it alone. The community cannot do it alone. But if you put those two forces together, you have an awesome power to bring about fundamental change. I was very interested in hearing the pastor talk about the religious community. I started off in Atlanta when I was a public safety commissioner, organizing the religious community. We call it the Atlanta Religious Mobilization, Ministers Mobilized Against Crime. I brought the same concept to Houston. Houston Ministers Against Crime, same thing in New York. I point that out as an example that there's a role for everyone in the community to play to deal with the issue of crime. Again, it's clear, I'm a criminologist. I have a couple of masters and a PhD in criminology, and I studied the etiology of crime, or why people commit crime. I understand the theories, and what's quite clear to me, we can't arrest ourselves out of the problem. The objective has to be, how do you prevent crime from occurring to begin with? After school programs to keep children out of trouble to begin, because the hours between 3 and 5 is when most of the kids get in trouble, because both parents are working, they're left unsupervised. That takes a commitment on part of the community to put funds in after-school programs, have constructive activities for young people. Not looking at crime as just a general concept. You say, I'm going to reduce crime in Boston. That doesn't mean very much. But if you break it down neighborhood by neighborhood and understand the issues in that neighborhood and focus your resources there, you can make a tremendous difference. That's one of the reasons I'm such a strong advocate of community policing, because it involves addressing the issues of a particular neighborhood, not just crime, but other aspects. In fact, when I became the mayor, I implemented the concept of community policing into all city government. I call it neighborhood-oriented government. And we allowed ourselves, the city, to empower the community. We divided our city into what we call super neighborhoods, 88 super neighborhoods. They created their own council, and they determined what they wanted by developing an action plan for their neighborhoods. Then it became my job as mayor to make sure my department heads delivered those services that the people themselves felt that they wanted. So long answer to your question, but your question can't be answered in a short way. It's a very complicated process. We start talking about the issues of crime. There are no simple answers to it.
Now I'm going to get to Mr. Jones in just a minute. I want to talk about the role of the media as well. The question is, both of you, what do you think the impact has been in terms of education and jobs? That a lot of people are looking for, how do we work? How do we get through school? And it's much harder now than it is. People think that they can drop out of school and get a job like their grandfather did. They can't, right? They think that they don't need it. And what happened in terms of not just law enforcement, not just the clergy going out, but the whole idea of education and jobs, how important are those, and what both of you are thinking about what to do?
I'd argue that if you're going to ask young people to go in a different direction, you've got to give them an alternative. And that includes a decent education that's going to help them, I think, not just become an employee, but an engaged citizen. A citizen who thinks that they can, in fact, have some impact on the decisions that are affecting their lives. So the education, the workforce part of it is key. If I could also add just one other thing, because I think Dr. Brown really underplays the kind of role that he played, I think, in introducing what was a very new concept at the time. And that was that, in fact, police had to be partners with the communities they were policing.
Which meant they had to get out of their cars. They had
exactly
to
right.
Go and meet people, not with the gun, but with the handshake, and all that made a big difference.
Well, and let me add the flip side of that, too. I think that one of the things that we learned as clergy and lay people who are involved in this is that we also had to stop stereotyping police in the way that we often felt police stereotype our community. We had to learn that, in fact, police departments, like most institutions, are not monolithic. As we would often say, we're trying to find the 10 or 15% of police who are cowboys, because we got to neutralize them. And we're trying to find the 10 or 15% who are the Lee Browns, because we have to ally with them. And then we got to do something to sway the other 70% so that they follow the leadership of a Lee Brown, and not either sort of stay on the sidelines.
Okay.
And I think communities can drive that dynamic. They have to drive it.
I think education and employment is very critical to the issue of crime. Look at your prisons. Who are in prisons? Majority are minorities. Most of the ones that are there were unemployed or underemployed when they were arrested. Most have used drugs right prior to committing the crime. Most are school dropouts. If you put those factors together, it becomes quite clear what the factors are that cause criminal behavior. If we're going to be successful in addressing the crime problem, we have to also address those problems that create crime. Education and employment becomes very critical in that context.
Mr. Jones, the press has been looked at as...
Professor Ogletree.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. We can hear you.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to that. When we have a school system that does not prepare our students for college, for career and life, that school system and the work that we're doing in education becomes irrelevant. Because it's eventually going to look for other alternatives. So we have to get that right. I think Dr. Brown was correct when he talked about we have to look at your prison population and figure out where they went off track. And I think Dr. Brown can also agree that in order to be successful in the present and over the long run, when we come to reducing and preventing crime, we have to be hard on those repeat violent offenders. but we also have to stop the pipeline of youth. You know, some of those things, we know that penal institutions determine their future need by the literacy rates of second graders and third graders. So what do? I have a marriage book club that is encouraging reading in kids. I have reading angels that are mentors in the schools. They're going in to make sure that kids are reading at grade level by age 3, by grade 3. Why? Because I know that it's not a quick fix, but over the long term, that means that we'll have fewer and fewer kids that enter that pipeline because we're not losing them in the school system. But it has to be a continuum of prevention in order for it to work. And it has to be, and Dr. Brown, I know that you know this, community-led. But we have the issue of police brutality. We can't get people to be quiet. Everybody has seen what's happened. Everybody has a version of what's happened. However, you have a 3-year-old girl lost her life playing in her front yard, Bethel A.M.E. People were outside. People saw what happened. We can't get anybody to give us enough information to charge someone. We have to do better as a community to speak up for ourselves. Because if the police weren't there to witness it, what can they do? The community doesn't come forward.
Thank you, great. Mr. Jones, let me ask you about this, the whole idea that the media is both given credit for what it's showing and then given blame for what it's showing as well.
We're used to that.
Right. And the first thing we saw in the Michael Brown case was, Michael Brown allegedly going into a store, harassing some of the owners, pulling some things down, et cetera. And that was on for a very long time. And so people drew opinions about him, and it divided our communities, black and white.
I would say that the image that they saw initially was the body of Michael Brown on the street for 4 hours after he was shot, because all these cell phones that we carry, they had those up and were tweeted all over the world, for that matter, almost instantaneously. I know that the city of Ferguson, I assume it was the police, released that video. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people played it again and again, and that kind of thing is going to happen. I mean, that was part of the story too. But I think that the issue often is, from a journalist's point of view, is that people want the media to focus on the things they want them to focus on and don't want them to focus on the other things. Mm-hmm. That's not the way it's going to work, and that's why everybody is unhappy with part of the coverage. However, the net result, I believe, in a place like Ferguson, and the thing I think that makes Ferguson different from Houston or Boston or Baltimore, is that this is a town whose government simply did not represent at all the population of the town. Now, there are Fergusons all over the country, especially in suburbs of cities like St. Louis. But there's a remedy for that. And the thing that the media has done that may turn out to have been the most important thing in many respects is to call attention to just how out of whack Ferguson was. Ferguson is a place with the power, through voting, through politics, to change the government. And by changing the government, to change the police and to change some of the other things. Now, issues of education, and I mean, there are always going to be these terrible problems. They're endemic. But the problem you got to start with in a place like Ferguson, it seems to me, is to get a new government, a new city administration. I mean, you would not expect that Bull Connor was going to reform the police department. That's not going to happen. And I'm not necessarily comparing them to, I don't think necessarily that's even fair, but it seems quite clear that you have a heavily minority population of citizens and a tiny number of minorities on the police force and a lot of complaints and history. You're going to have to change the governance aspects of it. I would say that when this man was able to do the, introduce this remarkable idea, he couldn't have done it without the administration of the city backing him. He needed that. The police chief who will reform the police in Ferguson is going to need a city administration that will give him the power and the tools. And I believe that the media has had a significant role in showing that places like Ferguson can change, should change, must change.
Thank you. We have microphones, 2 on the floor, left and right, and 2 up here, up a little higher on the left and right. And so if you want to ask questions, get in front of the microphone. Again, try to make sure the questions are short and very specific, and either to one of the 4 panelists or to all of them. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Julian Duran. I'm a first-year student here at the college, and honestly, I'd like to hear all of your opinions on this. It's about media sensationalism and also the bias. Like, do you think it's gotten worse over the years, and if so, why?
Good question.
Media sensationalism has been around as long as there's been media. I think that there is so much more media now and so much more opportunity for spreading the most sensational kinds of images around very, very quickly that, of course, there's more. I mean, look at what's been happening with ISIS and beheadings. Who would have thought that a public beheading would be something that someone would want to post and then so many millions of people would want to watch on something as generic now to our nation, our culture, as YouTube? I think that's just the world we live in now, and it's always going to be that way. And I think as long as people are able to effectively act as their own journalism mechanisms, take the images and upload them and have them then virally circulate, there's going to be quantities of sensationalism. That's why I hope that journalism is not going to disappear, because journalism is what takes the situation and the sensational aspects of it and brings it down to a rational, coherent understanding of the complexity and nuance there that sensationalism, the greatest crime of sensationalism is that it distorts. It often does anyway. But it's also true that sensationalism calls attention to sensational situations. And when you have, as I say, I go back to the civil rights movement, the people in Birmingham, Alabama were complaining about media sensationalism because that video of those terrible things that were happening there was something that made people unhappy. It was sensational, but it was true. And I think that's part of the problem. It's very hard sometimes for us to look in that mirror, and sensationalism may be distasteful, but it often is quite true as well.
Any other quick responses to the question? All right. Next question, yes.
I would only say.
Go ahead. The next question.
If I could, Professor.
Next question. Go ahead.
Challenge about sensationalism.
We're
is
missing
when the
you.
press. Okay,
We're getting every third word. I think. Go ahead. Question.
In addition to the media, a lot of people across the country immediately sensed that this was a national event. Folks hopped in their cars, and other folks, including Sharpton and Jackson, hopped on their planes and arrived in Ferguson. Would you all talk about that event, about that conglomeration onto the city and what you think it means?
I want to speak to that very briefly, because I think that one of the things that was really a terrible distortion was that the Fox News people, especially that ilk, were saying, where's Jesse Jackson, and why are they there? Why aren't they in Chicago dealing with all the terrible crime situation there? Well, they have been in Chicago. They've been in Chicago repeatedly. They've been doing what they are supposed to do in this kind of area. So I think their coming to Ferguson was part of something that they have become identified with doing. They go to these places, and they go to Ferguson just like they also went to Chicago. I'm not trying to portray them as some kind of idealized people, but I think that the fact that they went there did add to the sense of importance of this and what was happening.
But lots of lay people went too. Lot of grassroots people.
Absolutely.
Other comments?
I would agree with what's just been said. They do bring immediate attention wherever they go if there's an issue. And in many cases, that's what we need, is the media attention. As was just stated, during the civil rights movement, we saw some of the greatest emphasis for change come about when the television was capturing what was going on, where the police were beating people, the fire hoses, the dogs, and all of that. So they do serve I think, a very important purpose of bringing to the forefront some of the issues that exist in communities.
Mayor Blake, you want to comment on this question about the press?
I think it's very important to acknowledge, recognize that it was important, as was said, for our civil rights to be. It was a civil rights issue. The point that I was trying to make earlier, when you talk about sensationalism in the media, is when journalists fail to put those incidents put them into context. They ride the wave of sensationalism. I think it's a challenge, and it diminishes what I think is the professionalism of the media.
Thank you. Question left upstairs.
Yeah, hi, my name is Max Liebeskin. I'm a sophomore at the college. To what extent is simply the incredibly large number of guns present in the United States and the, frankly, relatively low level of gun control, to what extent does that explain the very, very high homicide rate here compared to other developed countries in, say, Western Europe?
It explains it to a large degree. No guns, no shooting people. I have been a strong advocate for years to have gun control. When I worked for President Clinton as his drug czar, we addressed that issue, got some gun control legislation passed in his 1994 crime control bill, particularly dealing with the issue of assault weapons, which I believe have no use at all in our civilized society. I often, when I talk to people about guns, I give an analogy. When my mother and my grandmother and my grandfather got into an argument, the weapon they had in their house was the rolling pin. She might pick it up and hit him over the head, but he's around the next day. Now the weapon that's available is a gun. You have the same degree of anger, but the consequences are totally different. I think the greater the proliferation of guns you have, the more shootings you're going to have, the more problems, the more deaths. So I strongly advocate gun control.
Dr. Braun, I'm asking a question to you, but to everybody. Are things going to change? Are we going to have a crime-free or crime-reduced community, you think, in the 21st century?
One of the reasons I closed my remarks today was by asking everyone to write the president and ask him to convene a commission on the administration of justice, which should include crime, is to get a roadmap that we can all follow. As I mentioned with the 67 Crime Commission, we saw some monumental changes take place in the police. You have more educated police officers, for example. You saw changes in your court system, your prosecutor's office, because we had a national initiative that involved not only the president, but also the Congress. And looking at the best practices, what's necessary to address the issues of crime, looking at what causes crime and how do we address those issues. So I think if we had a roadmap, a platform that we all could follow, we can make a difference. In my career, I've seen us make a difference in cities that I've worked in. But to do that, it wasn't just the police trying to go out and arrest people. The objective is to prevent crime to begin with. That should be your first priority. And in doing so, you have to involve literally everyone in the community, your educators, your religious community, your business community. Everyone has to be involved. If that's not going to happen, then we shall continue to see the problems that we see today.
Great comment.
I'd only add that I would agree, we certainly have to change policy. I think the tougher battle is going to be to change culture. So for example, around gun control, I'd argue in some ways the intractable difficulty there. I mean, everyone was so convinced that after Sandy Hook, we'd make some progress on this. And I think that's because we underestimate the power of what I'd call the unholy trinity of fear, ideology, and profits. And until we crack that, and that's going to take some work, it's going to be very difficult to make progress. We're making it, it's slow, but it's going to take a lot of time. And I think around more effective policing. I mean, we have made a lot of progress in many places, precisely because folks have really talked about community policing, but Ferguson reminds us that there are a lot of local communities that haven't heard the news at all. And it's going to take time to really get through.
A couple of quick questions. Anyone on the right side upstairs? Questions? Yep, go ahead.
Mr. Jones mentioned Black Twitter and comedian reporters such as Jon Stewart as alternatives to traditional journalism that we sort of praise. And I'm wondering what that means for Black America and what that means for traditional journalism right now, that these avenues are essentially doing a superior job of communicating the thoughts and experiences of Black Americans today.
And before Mr. Jones responds, do you have an answer? What do you think it means from your point of view as a young person thinking about the future?
I see implications in maybe changing the way that we get news and information, and possibly a need for a reform in the way that traditional journalism is conducted.
Mr. Jones?
Well, Black Twitter is something that basically has come of age just in the last, little while, in a way. I think that Twitter itself is something that is now a force in news coverage everywhere, especially when it comes to things like breaking news and commentary. However, I don't believe that Twitter is going to, or Jon Stewart, are going to be substitutes for professional reported news. I think that that is something that we cannot afford as a society to give up, because it's too easy. It's too easy to, Jon Stewart is a special case. Jon Stewart has discipline, but Jon Stewart is not the only guy out there trying to make humor out of current events. And if you're irresponsible or reckless with that, you can do an awful lot of damage and distort a lot of things. I think that we need to have a place where we can go as a society that will say, this is to the best of our professionally, tuned and constructed knowledge, what happened. Most of what I believed ultimately about what happened in Ferguson was reported in traditional news, in the New York Times and some other places. That didn't mean I didn't look at Black Twitter, I didn't watch Jon Stewart, I didn't go on television. But I worked for the New York Times for a long time, and I'm probably prejudiced in that way. But I believe that there's an absolutely essential social role for people whose job it is to go out and really find out what happened and try to put it in some kind of a context.
Boy, Jon Stewart's going to be talking about you tonight. Good luck. Question to the right.
Hi, I'm a 1L at the law school, and I'm also coming from St. Louis and very much a part of the Ferguson community. And I'm just really curious how my community is supposed to reconcile the influx of these panels and all these Know Your Rights campaigns and after-school programs, and still have people who've gone through those programs, people who know their rights, and they're still getting gunned down in the streets. So how would you reconcile that to a young person, that they need to, subscribe to these conversations when people who have are still being killed?
I think it's a reminder that the path of progress is very slow. It's often 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. That was true for civil rights, it was true for abolition, it's true for almost any movement that you can look at. And so I think part of the message, and it's one reason why, as in some levels as dispirited as I feel about this, I was looking on at a slideshow of the cases that have garnered attention since 1999, going back to Amadou Diallo and so on. And it, on one level, it will depress you. But on another side, I really do see progress. These things can't get swept under the rug the way they once did. They garner that kind of national and international attention. They force change. And so part of the message, I think, to young people is that real change is painful. It's difficult, and it's sometimes very slow. But the victory comes to those who don't give up, who stick in there even though sometimes you wonder why you're doing it.
Mayor Rawlings-Blake, do you want to say anything before we go to the next question?
I would just say that the failure that I saw in Ferguson isn't a lack of programs or education, failure, a lack of commitment of those who are in government to be in real relationship with the majority of the people who they represent. And I think what I would say to that young person from St. Louis is that what is required is the work that got us paid during the civil rights movement, the activism and the commitment to vote. I think the number of and I haven't confirmed this number, but what I heard about the number of African Americans who voted in Ferguson, less than 10%. In order for there to be the change that she wants to see, that has to be different. There has to be more engaged, and there has to be more involvement of the community in making sure that their needs are being met. And they can't be heard if they're not putting themselves in the position to be heard, and that is to participate. So that work, which, Pastor Hammond, mentioned it, that work is not easy work. It is labor intensive and it's time intensive. And in order to see change, it's going to take more than one person. It's going to take that community coming together and demanding more. And that doesn't happen, in a 30-minute time slot.
It's interesting. I'll just say a word about that, the community of Ferguson in St. Louis. It was depressing to see that 20% of the people, only 20%, would participate in voting regularly. And they were the majority of the community. And that the majority of the people who were running the city were not African Americans, even though African Americans were the majority of the city. The majority of the city, African Americans, but they weren't in the police force, right? And so all these things come together, and that's what caused this, I think, implosion that made a big difference. We had a question here on the left. You? Yes.
Mayor and Dr. Brown.
You can move it down if you want to. Move the microphone down.
Mayor, this is for Dr. Brown. Given the huge variety of different independent police departments in the country, are there national standards and professional certifications? You mentioned a national commission, and would that be the way to change that or look into that? I've never been aware of how that gets established.
Some years ago, the major police organizations, Police Chiefs Association, National Organization, Black Law Enforcement Executives, Police Executive Research Forum, we all came together to form the National Association of Accreditation of Police Departments. It's voluntary. One does not have to, under any circumstances, apply for accreditation. But we did develop standards that we felt were appropriate for law enforcement agencies. I don't think we're lacking standards. Probably if you look at the policies, procedures of any police department, they're probably the right thing. And that's probably one of the advantages that we have over police officers. If we have rules and regulations, we can always hold over their head. But we have to look at how do you change the culture of a police agency? How do you change that culture? And that's why I stress that we have to change the systems that support the police department. We have to have values. When I went to large cities, Houston and New York City, there was no set of values to guide policy setting, no set of values to guide training, no set of values to guide the officers' duties on the streets. So we have to change your culture, you have to also change the values. And so it's more than just written policies and procedures. Probably every police agency has written policies and procedures. It's how you train them, the context in which they operate with the value system with the department. So it's much more involved than just the writing, even though we do have, to answer your question, a system of accreditation of police agencies, but it's completely voluntary.
We're just about out of time, so what I'm going to do, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. I'm going to ask all of you to ask your questions at once, and then have someone answer the questions, one of the 4 people that we have. And start with you, sir, and go up, and then down to both of these people.
Thank you. For a question for Chief Brown. Bearing in mind the relevance of child development theories on future outcomes. Was Charles Barkley correct in defending Adrian Peterson's behavior toward his son, or apparently two sons, in the manner in which he administered discipline? That's a short question.
Okay, question here?
Hi, I'm David Hay from the Graduate School of Education, Doctor of Education Leadership Program. My question is about the response. So there was the event and the response, and one dimension of the response that hit us heavy, looking down at Anise, who brought this conversation to our cohort, was what schools did or didn't do in the aftermath at Ferguson. And one of the big questions that weighs on us is the length of time that the schools were closed. And I'm just wondering if, I know, Mayor, you talked about education and the role of education, but if anybody would be able to respond to that and your thoughts on what went well and what went awful during the response.
Question at the top right.
Hi, Sarah Cole, President of the Harvard College Black Students Association. My question is in response to something Mayor Rawlings-Blake and Mr. Jones mentioned regarding policy change. When the Ferguson police officers are heavily controlled by the St. Louis County Police Department, which is in the county is 70% white, how can communities like Ferguson make sure that policies actually reflect what they need and decisions aren't being made for them?
Thank you. Questions here?
Good evening, my name is Jamie Johnson. I'm a mid-career student here. I'm also a lieutenant from the Metropolitan Police in London. Firstly, to Dr. Brown, Derica and I will draft the letter for you if you need those services, very willing. My question links teaching, education, transparency and communication. What are your views on body cams for police officers? Because I believe that is a solution staring us in the face. Thank you.
And there's a big audience beyond the people watching. You want to say just a word so people know what you mean by body cams? I know what you mean, but
cameras worn on police officers so police can record what's happening in front of them, and that can be analysed to discipline them, or in a prosecution, or to educate the public.
And they can turn them off too.
They can, but
Yes.
I think the details need.
Great. Yep. Question?
Hi, Simona Bagenrin, first-year college student. My question is regards to both Ferguson and perhaps maybe extrapolating to other situations around the country. Just a 6-word question: can justice ever truly be served?
Good question. You guys want to take any one of those?
I think justice can be served, but let's keep in mind when we talk about the police that the same social machinery that produced everyone else in society also produced the police. When you have racism in society, you have racism in police departments. So we have to look at our complete society in order to bring about some changes. Things have to change beyond the police department. I support the cameras for the police. I also support citizens having their own cameras to record what the police are doing, so it can go both ways. If you have something on film, it makes a difference. You can't argue in one way or the other. The truth is the truth is the truth. So when it's all said and done, it's my belief it's a broader issue that goes beyond the police. When we look at a crisis such we saw in Ferguson, we have to understand that what happens before the crisis will determine what happens during the crisis and what happens after the crisis. And that's the reason I'm such an advocate of the concept of community policing, where you get the entire community involved, and the objective is to keep your community safe, working together to make a safer community. You do that by solving some of the problems, working together. If there are crimes that are being committed, you are willing to help the police solve the crime, and ultimately you end up with a safer neighborhood.
Great. Any other quick comments on the questions that were asked?
I'd only add that I think justice not only can prevail, in some ways it has to, and we have to proceed on that presumption. Will we ever get there perfectly? No. And when we do get there, at some moments it's fleeting, because it constantly has to be worked for. I'm old enough to remember a country where I had to drink from a different fountain because I was black. I'm old enough to remember a country where I had to carry fried chicken and Wonder Bread whenever I went south because there were not places that would serve me. very different dynamic now because people who believed that it could be strived for didn't give up. It's always got to be fought for. Every generation that fight has got to be renewed, but it can prevail.
If
yes.
I may, I want to just address briefly the issue about what can Ferguson do in light of St. Louis County and so forth. I don't really have an answer to that, but I know that the first step is that Ferguson has to take back its own city government. It's got to get those people who are the majority of the citizens to vote and to put a group of people into Ferguson itself, and then you can take the next step from there.
Mayor Blake, anything you want to say? Rawlings-Blake, in conclusion?
Yeah, I would say first, I wish Pastor Hammond hadn't mentioned fried chicken and Wonder Bread. That's making me hungry. But after that, I would say, I would say that will justice ever be served? I think if you love our country and you are willing to fight for the future of it, we have to fight for justice as well. And I firmly believe, and I'm optimistic and hopeful, that justice can be served, and it will be served again when when the community is engaged, involved, and when people in government respect that relationship.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Great. Anybody else quick comment?
I'll make just one final observation. Public policy is set by people who we elect to office. If you don't register to vote, you don't vote, then you can't elect people that will look out for your best interests.
I would say the same thing in the same words, that if you don't vote, you don't count, and that's a big problem. Now, I want to make sure, Charles Barkley is a very big guy, very large, and I'm John Smith, if he asks who said this about him. I'm John Smith, remember my name, right? But he's talking about spankings and children, and all of us probably had parents and grandparents who, when we were younger, much younger, would make that happen. And it's not happening now. And I think that's a good thing. I think that we've figured out there are other ways to resolve the issue. And I think that if we can learn anything, we need to learn from the experience that, you know, a good spanking that Adrian Peterson did, that hitting a woman that Ray Rice did, hitting his fiance, then wife, that's unacceptable. It's just completely unacceptable. And we have to stand up against it and make sure that we say the right words, that make sure that no one can do that. And you can't do it in sports. We have every Sunday, somebody's watching football and paying a lot of money, right, to see people injure each other. And then people come home and do the same thing to their partners. It makes no sense at all. We didn't talk much about sexual orientation. We didn't talk much about immigrants. All those were issues that I think are important. We wish we had all week, and not just all day and all night, but all week to talk about these issues. And I hope that there'll be other times that we can have a chance to deal with some of these issues here. Thank all of these panelists for their great participation, and thank all of you for coming. Thanks.